Chapter 91, Mighty Warrior 4. It was a lump of blue light. It was so beautiful that it was hard to believe that it came out of a terrifying monster like Agares. The fire enveloped the bright light. The tip of Amon became a part of Yong-ho, allowing him to consume Agares' spirit. He first felt pleasure and then trembled. It was a big shock, which made it difficult for him to breathe. It was blue, it was a lightning type. Greed was awakened, and it consumed Agares' spirit through the fire. It suppressed its powers so that it wouldn't lose anything. Instead of swallowing it whole, greed broke it apart into a million pieces and thoroughly analyzed it. It's safe to say that one spirit was that family's history. There were traces of all the spirits that Agares had consumed up until now. They were useless. They were just traces that couldn't be used. But greed didn't allow it. When Yong-ho's mana grew stronger, the power of evolution wasn't the only thing that grew too. The spirit's color and element that remained within the traces. It was different from the ones before. It was impossible for Yong-ho to control the elements separately, like how he did with Foras coldness, but he could build it up, analyze it, and help his body to accept it. Color and element weren't the only things he acquired. Agares was a predator. He acquired new traits by eating, and that's how he evolved. It wasn't the power of a demon king, it was a natural trait that his race had. That trait, the power of evolution, yelled. For the power of evolution, greed stored that skill on one side of Yong-ho's mana. It was impossible for Yong-ho to use that skill, but it was possible for him to transfer that skill to someone with similar characteristics and strengthen their skill, Yuri. The Princess Ant's face popped into his head. He then felt an exhilarating pleasure, interrupting his thoughts. Agares' spirit was bigger than any of the other spirits that Yong-ho consumed. It was really distorted, so it wasn't very pure, but the amount made up for it. It felt like his spirit and physical body was going to blow apart. He had to release his power. He was disappointed by the fact that he couldn't consume some of the power, but he had to release it. All the other demon kings had to do the same when they consumed a spirit, and it was more than they could handle. But greed rejected him this time too. If Yong-ho's body couldn't handle Agares' mana, then it would make it so that his body could handle it. A new bowl. A larger and stronger bowl that can be filled with strong mana. The power of evolution was activated. Agares' mana evolved Yong-ho's body. A flash of green light enveloped Yong-ho's entire body. It began to restructure his body. It was safe to say that he was obtaining a new body. His body was developing as mana circulated within him, and the passages that's been blocked before were now open. His body became stronger. His bones became stronger as they contained more mana, and his physical skills increased. Yong-ho didn't forget about his wish. He grew a bit taller. His body looked a lot more appealing. And lastly, someone was cheering for Yong-ho's development. Amon, the Red Lotus Demon Lance, had been waiting for this moment. The moment where he won't have to suppress his powers. The moment where he'll be able to use his powers. Of course, Yong-ho was still lacking. He still had a long way to go. But it felt like he could take a step forward. He could use his powers a little more freely. Fire appeared on Yong-ho's wrist, which was still enveloped in the green light. The red fire transformed into a lance. Amon wanted to show his owner a part of his true form. Fire and fire. The green and red fire clashed against each other. They burned together and created a giant light. It disappeared with the wind. Yong-ho took a deep breath. It was the first breath he took after his body transformed. His senses became more sensitive. Even though his eyes were closed, it felt like he could feel everyone's presence really well. The transformation only took 10 seconds, but it was safe to say that the time on the battlefield stopped during that time. The insect-type monsters realized that Agares had died. Some of them became weak, and others started moving more violently. The spirits that weren't directly connected to Agares saw the enormous fire. They saw the lifeless Agares, and realized that his shell was the only thing that was left. Agares was dead. He lost, and the owner of the House of Mammon, the Demon King of Fire, consumed his spirit. Yong-ho opened his eyes. Instead of looking at Agares' corpse, he looked elsewhere. He looked at Salami, who landed on the ground and looked slightly scared. "You're exhausted." Salami was the spirit that worked the hardest out of all. the spirits that belonged to the house of Mammon. Salami calmed down when Yong-ho spoke and tried to smile with its eyes. Yong-ho petted Salami's nose and spoke. Hang in there. Salami was confused and blinked, but Yong-ho didn't stop smiling. The fight wasn't over. Even though Agares was dead, his troops were still standing. Even though they were on the brink of collapsing, there were still over 100 spirits. Salami's wings were at its limit. Yong-ho knew that too. That's why he said that earlier. With his new body, he gathered his mana and activated the power of evolution. Green flames rose up from his eyes, and he saw a box of light. Salamander, a salt-type development. The green light that appeared on the tip of Yong-ho's finger enveloped Salami's body. Salami roared. The wings grew bigger and stronger, and its body transformed into a more aggressive one. Salami's front feet and shoulders became bigger. His claws became sharper, and scales appeared on his body, similar to a dragon's. Thorns grew on Salami's slim waist and tail. If Salami looked like an ordinary car before, now he looked like an armored car. After the evolution finished, hot air was released from Salami's mouth. Yong-ho smiled and looked around. His eyes landed on Catalina and Ophelia. Catalina covered her face with her hands as her tail and ears flapped. The gap between her fingers was pretty big, so he was able to see her blue eyes filled with excitement and her red cheeks. Ophelia, on the other hand, had a smirk on her face. She signaled Yong-ho with her eyes. Impressive. Yong-ho looked down, wondering what the two ladies were looking at, and when he realized, he laughed awkwardly and put his hands down. While his body was transforming, the fire burned everything, so he was naked. I was wondering why it was chilly. Yong-ho used his mana. After activating a dark green light, he used it to cover the lower part of his body and then got on Salami's back. Shall we finish this? Yong-ho spoke. Catalina and Ophelia both answered in their own ways. Salami spread its wings. After kicking off the ground and flapping its wing, a strong wind covered the ground. My young owner. He heard Aemon's voice. Yong-ho swung his right arm as if that was his reply to Aemon's calling. Just like his body, he wielded the lance's new form. The spirits that witnessed Agares' death were running away. The insect-type monsters were violently jumping around, as if this was their last attempt at bringing Yong-ho down. Skull. He saw Skull, who was swinging his warhammer around. Yong-ho didn't wait any longer. Salami was circling around in the air, and he gave his command. Salami's fiery wings made the sky cloudy, the fiery lance that divided the battleground. He finished the battle, just like he had stated earlier. The fight with Agares was now completely over, 3 hours after it had started. The insect-type monsters didn't know how to quit or surrender. They had no choice but to kill each and every one of them. Most of the spirits that were under Agares' control after he devoured their owners had ran away. The insects' violent movements had given them time to run. When looking at just the results, the Free City had achieved victory. Even though Agares had twice as many troops, they had managed to defeat them and even brought down Agares himself. However, the Free City was damaged pretty badly as well. Out of the 3 leaders of the Free City, Dagon had died. Despite the fact that trolls had strong regeneration skills, Oros fainted right before the war ended because of his injury. Out of the Free City soldiers, the elite soldiers that Ophelia commanded to go with Skull experienced the most damage. During the most important moment, they became Yong-ho's shield, so they fought the most enemies, and because of that, they had the most injuries. Out of the 3 leaders, Ophelia was in the best condition, so she took care of the soldiers. The Workers' Guild and the Outlaws were against following Ophelia's orders, but since Yong-ho was standing behind her, they kept their opinions to themselves. They didn't even have the strength to protest. They needed some time in order to make a complaint. Ophelia wasn't planning on standing by and watching them protest, but she wasn't going to pick on someone either. In the end, the Free City will belong to the House of Mammon. Oros probably realized that Ophelia was the House of Mammon's spirit before passing out based on the way she talked. I'll leave the Free City up to you. Yong-ho wore a suit that he obtained at the last minute and spoke while getting on the horse. Ophelia spoke worriedly while her tail moved weakly. Is it really okay for you to start moving, Skull? And the others may be okay since they're undead, but still, we don't have a lot of time. Yong-ho and Ophelia were standing in front of the gate. They haven't even finished cleaning up the corpses, but Yong-ho Catalina, Skull, and the other spirits were outside. He didn't have enough time. If Agarez died, that meant that the spirits of the dungeons that were under Agarez's control had died as well. No matter how many soldiers Agarez had, they probably noticed that he had died. The other owners in the east may have realized that there were changes going on in Agarez's dungeon. While consuming Agarez's spirit, there were a few things that Yong-ho realized. Agarez was an actual predator. The reason why he was able to gather 1,000 soldiers was because he emptied the dungeons after he took them over. It was impossible to take all the dungeons that were under his control, but he could at least take the 2 dungeons that were near the Free City. Things had already been delayed. He had to move now. Fine. Ophelia looked at Catalina worriedly, so she spoke to both Ophelia and Yong-ho. Just like Yong-ho, she was exhausted after continuously fighting. But that didn't mean she was going to fall behind. Catalina was Yong-ho's personal guard. Salami worked the hardest, and despite letting a small cry, no one heard it. Yong-ho and Catalina got on Salami's back. Skull laughed while petting Nightmare's mane, and the Skull unit didn't look tired at all as they waited for everyone to start heading out. "I'll be back," Yong-ho spoke, and Ophelia gave up in the end. She showed respect by seeing him off's daughter. "Ophelia will gladly wait for your return, master." Salami flapped his wings and flew towards the east. Skull Nightmare started to gallop. The Skull unit closely followed their leader. Ophelia, who was now alone, brushed back her gold hair. She looked at the House of Mammon's spirits who were heading to the east. She recalled the face her father made when he shouted that the House of Mammon was going to be revived. Chapter 92. Return. Yong-ho's first stop was the dungeon of the House of A-Lee. It was a natural choice because it was only 2 days away from the Free City. If he moved quickly, it would be possible to get there even sooner. Acquiring the dungeon was much easier than he had expected. Since it was the starting point for the mobilization of his army, Agarez had completely emptied A-Lee's dungeon. The few troops left behind by Agarez had all seemed to have fled after noticing Agarez's demise. Agarez was a natural predator. He literally devoured the fallen king of the dungeon and was the object of terror to those who had surrendered. Moreover, the traces left in the dungeon of A-Lee indicated that not only was the king devoured by Agarez, but some of his servants were as well. Except for the insect-type spirits, who basically acted as his limbs, the rest of the spirits that followed him were dominated by fear. The source of that fear was now gone, so it was quite natural for them to escape. That wasn't the only good news. Not only were there no spirits, but the dungeon was void of traps as well. All that remained were the wreckages of broken traps. They were probably traps that Agarez had destroyed in the process of devouring the House of A-Lee. Agarez did not restore the traps, and instead only used the dungeon of A-Lee as a place to rest. There were no spirits and no traps. In the end, it was only the complexity of the structure of the dungeon that impeded Yong-ho's movement, but that was no hindrance to the power of greed. The only issue was that the heart of the dungeon of A-Lee was in a severe state. The dungeon wasn't the only thing that had suffered a severe wound. The heart looked like it had been mutilated by the teeth of an animal. Yong-ho extracted the mana from the heart of the A-Lee's dungeon, and then wrapped it in cold mana and stored it in his pocket. It was not that he didn't covet the mana of the dungeon's heart, but he decided it would be better to give it to Lucia. Lucia still hadn't obtained full control over the first floor of Mammon's dungeon. In order to acquire the legacy left by Mammon, it was important for Lucia to grow Lucia to gain control of the lower floors. After resting for half a day in A-Lee's dungeon, Yong-ho then headed straight to the next dungeon. Judging from the state of the A-Lee's dungeon, the other dungeons under Agarez's control were likely in a similar position. If the other owners in the east had noticed Agarez's death, then they too would have probably have entered the dungeons, just like Yong-ho had done. Nightmare, who was carrying Skull, hid its tiredness and pretended to remain strong, which also caused Salami to stop groaning as well. The next dungeon that Yong-ho arrived at after the House of A-Lee was the House of Yubing. Just like A-Lee's dungeon, Yong-ho quickly acquired Yubing's dungeon in the same fashion. Unlike A-Lee's dungeon, there were a few insect monsters left, but in front of the elite of the Mammon family, they were equivalent to just scraps of firewood. After extracting the mana from the heart of Yubing's dungeon, Yong-ho had a brief moment of conflict. He was greedy. Could he take a third dungeon? If they strained themselves a little more, then he would be able to collect even more mana. Greed arose. Although it didn't ask Yong-ho to choose, it mirrored his deepest desires. He wanted to consume. He wanted to possess. Yong-ho closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He tamed his greed. He suppressed his desires. It was too much. They were already exhausted from days of traveling. It had already been 3 days since Agares's death. It would take more than 2 days to travel to the next nearest dungeon. So by the time he would arrive at the third dungeon, it would be far more likely that they would have to face other forces besides Agares's remaining troops. Yong-ho thought of the map of the empty southern region inside his head. It seemed that by visiting Yubing's dungeon, they were already outside of the south and now inside the eastern zone of the empty southern region. It was right to go back. Didn't Citri say that unrestrained desire wasn't true? Greed. Yong-ho asked Salami with his eyes to hold for a bit longer and returned to the Ailey's dungeon. After a sufficient rest at Ailey's dungeon, they would then head back to the Free City. An hour after they arrived at Ailey's dungeon, Yong-ho gathered the remaining furniture in the dungeon's entrance room and invoked the power of evolution while watching the burning bonfire. Some of the members of Skull Squad had filled their evolutionary rate. It was a natural result, considering that they had fought some of the most intense battles in the Free City. The only disappointment was that Skull himself, who had fought incredibly valiantly, had only half filled his evolutionary rate. However, that was most likely because Skull had already benefited the most from the power of evolution amongst all the spirits of the House of Mammon. In games, the higher the level that one achieved, the slower it would then take one to grow again. It's still a pity though. The promotion rank after the Skeleton Magic Knight had still not been revealed. Perhaps he would have to evolve him in a specific direction. Maybe he had to strengthen his mana or increase his physical ability like before. It was painful, yet exciting worry. Yong-ho then turned his attention to the Skull Squad's transportation. Just like their riders, the horses had filled their evolutionary rate. Feeling the importance of endurance from their long march, Yong-ho evolved the stamina of all 5 of them. And finally, the long-awaited highlight. Nightmare, from now on, you shall be named Bucephalus. He was going to give Skull the opportunity to give it a name. But that seemed a bit difficult. At the current rate, it would have been named either Skull, Skull, or Skull. Of course, the Nightmare didn't know of the origin of the name Bucephalus, the legendary horse of Alexander the Great, but regardless, it still gave out a pleasant whinny, as if she liked the name very much. Name, Bucephalus. Female. Race, Nightmare. Attributes, Darkness, Level 1. Individual trait, Proud. Individual skills, Stamina, Agility, Evolution rate, 1020 WWZIS, Timina, Level 1-2. 5 Strength, Level 1-2 Toughness, Level 1-2 TT, Agility, Level 0-2 TCT. Mana, Level 1-1. 5. Available promotions. Nightmare, Attack type. Nightmare, Agility type. Nightmare, Mana type. Yong-ho raised his hand towards the window of light and then called Skull after thinking. For a moment, Yong-ho expressed his intention to Skull as concisely and simply as possible. Which one do you want me to evolve? Skull answered immediately with a single concern. How to interpret Skull's answer could have been a problem, but Yong-ho immediately understood Skull's wish. That was only possible because of the bond between spirit and owner. Yong-ho evolved Bucephalus into the attack type. Like Salami, Bucephalus evolved to be quite large, but she was still a mare, so there her body retained her beautiful curves. She looked more like an armored tank from science fiction rather than an armored vehicle. After completing her evolution, Bucephalus looked back at Salami and gave out a pleasant snort as if she was smirking. Salami gave out a low growl in response, and then looked at Yong-ho with sparkling eyes. He seemed to want another evolution. However, it was too soon. Yong-ho stroked Salami's snout. Although he had grown bigger, he also looked more cute. Yong-ho then called Catalina. Catalina was Yong-ho's personal guard, so she had participated in every battle he had, except for the arena. Thanks to her outstanding performance in the recent battle, Catalina had filled her evolutionary rate. Yong-ho allowed Catalina to choose her evolutionary route just as he had done for Skull. However, unlike Skull, Catalina was able to clearly express her desire. I would like to increase my specialization in mana. Catalina was able to wield dark mana after evolving into a shadow runner. This time she didn't desire to be faster, but instead she desired to be able to better wield her newly acquired powers. Yong-ho also agreed with Catalina's wish because he thought, from the battle with Agarez, that it was essential to increase her offensive power. Okay, close your eyes and relax. You've done this countless times before, so you already know how this works. Of course, Catalina knelt down in front of Yong-ho and gently closed her eyes. As he was looking at Catalina, Yong-ho suddenly noticed her long, protruding ears. Her ears were fluttering so fast that it looked like she was about to fly away. Yong-ho unknowingly grabbed her eyes without thinking. Catalina flinched in surprise, but she didn't open her eyes. Lord, I think you'll get addicted to this feeling. The texture of her ears in his grasp was truly a strange feeling. Yong-ho closed his eyes and chanted the Heart Sutra, which he had picked up from somewhere. He invoked the power of evolution. It's done. Yong-ho spoke and let go of Catalina's ears. Fortunately, Catalina was distracted by her sudden increase in mana, so she didn't mention anything about her ears. Her ears fluttered as she began to examine her dark mana, but it was too early for him to feel relieved. Yong-ho quickly brought up another topic as soon as Catalina finished checking her mana. By the way, if one were to absorb the mana from the heart of the dungeon itself would die, right? Yes, master. So would the dungeon continue to shrink until it disappeared. Do dungeons occur naturally in nature? At Yong-ho's question, Catalina's eyes looked up as if she was searching her memories for an answer. Just as you said, dungeons do occur naturally, but infant dungeons are usually very small and fragile at birth, so they would probably soon die without the proper care of an owner. After Catalina mentioned an infant dungeon, Yong-ho thought of Lucia. Catalina continued to talk. Other than that, I've heard that, very occasionally, the dungeon market will sell something like the seed of a dungeon. Perhaps it's more accurate to call it an artificial dungeon. I've heard that they can be quite powerful, but I also heard that they're incredibly expensive. Apparently they're hard to produce en masse. It was quite an intriguing story. If it wasn't for the current turbulent times, then it would be unlikely for a dungeon to die. So it seemed that the natural cycle of the birth and death of dungeons was roughly equal. Catalina currently wore a cool expression, as if she was satisfied with the fact that she had answered well. Yong-ho smiled and looked again at Catalina's ears. He then noticed her wagging tail. He suddenly asked without knowing, "Hey, Catalina, yes, master, could I touch your tail?" Catalina's expression once again took on a dynamic change. While Yong-ho was in danger of falling into a new addition, Ophelia was calmly peeling an apple with a calm expression. She was currently inside the hospital, the only medical facility in the Free City and the home of the mad Oros. The room that they were in was quiet. Oros lay on the bed and didn't say a word, while Ophelia quietly devoted herself to peeling apples. The peeling sound of the apple amplified the silence instead of abating it. How long has it been? Ophelia took a bite of her freshly shaven apple, which caused Oros to open his eyes. He looked up at the ceiling, instead of towards Ophelia, and broke the silence. When was it? It was an endlessly open question, but Ophelia understood the mad Oros was a wise author from the days of old. So Ophelia answered him in a gentle manner. Since the first visit to the Free City by the House of Mammon, you know that my house was originally in servitude to the Mammon family. Right? Ophelia's father, Endelion, didn't hide his title. Oros exhaled a long breath. I knew that, but I didn't think that you would serve the Mammon family again like that so soon. It was impossible. No, you're right. At first, I didn't have the slightest intention of serving under his command. If I hadn't been completely overwhelmed by his pressure, then the story would have been quite different. Ophelia happily smiled. Oros rolled his eyes as he looked at the Ophelia before him. I don't think Dagon's death was within your calculations. Dagon died valiantly, however. It's true that I did consider that after the fight I would have to devote the Free City to the House of Mammon. Yes, I was planning on asking the House of Mammon for help. Ophelia did not deny it. She acted coolly so he wouldn't get angry. No, perhaps it's because I'm also quite positive about the situation. The moment that Agarez decided to invade the Free City, everything was already set in motion. This was just a natural step. The master will be back soon. Then the free city will become the territory of the Mammon family. You already got everything prepared, I guess. The fact that you and I are having a private meeting like this proves that everything is true. No matter how much friendship they had built over the past decade or so, the bar hostess and the guild leader had always been hostile to each other. However, Ophelia was now facing the defenseless Oros one-on-one. It would have been an impossible scenario unless Ophelia had not already taken over the guild. What about the outlaws? They give in to strength. The problem will be solved as soon as the master returns. There may be a few who rebel to the end, but it won't be a big deal. Ophelia cut the apple. She placed a piece into her mouth and looked at Oros. She began to talk slowly. Become a spirit of the House of Mammon. Just because the free city will be under the ownership of the Mammon family doesn't make much of a difference. Will he agree? Ophelia's suggestion was to turn the wolf into a hound. Oros laughed bitterly. What if I refuse? I don't want to lose you after Dagon. Ophelia appeared friendly and determined. Oros once again let out a laugh. Embryo is coming. Yes, that's right. The Western owners are united against him, but perhaps he'll win. We're going to have to fight him. Do you think the Mammon family can win? Ophelia smiled gracefully at the provocative question. No more questions or answer were necessary. 2 days later, the mad Oros greeted Yong-ho alongside Ophelia. He became a spirit of the House of Mammon. Chapter 93. Return 2. The site of the free city had not changed much. Many had been killed or injured, walls needed to be repaired, but that didn't change the color of the free city itself. Yong-ho had recently registered the mad Oros as a dungeon spirit and was now facing Ophelia in the pub. He wanted to receive not only the status of the free city, but also information regarding the movements of the neighboring dungeons. Of course, he also needed to share what he had personally seen and heard, and especially what he had received in his travels. The free city is quickly being cleaned up. Not that Oros has registered as one of your spirits. It's no exaggeration to say that the free city is now the territory of the House of Mammon. However, not everyone knows this yet, and I don't think that it's necessary to publish this information right now either. Isn't it really important? Yes, I suppose it will be okay if we announce it later. Ophelia smiled and offered Yong-ho a cocktail. There were many reasons why the mad Oros joined them. Ophelia was the leader of one of the 3 factions. To take complete control of the city, she needed the help of Oros, the leader of one of the other 3 factions. Furthermore, Oros was a competent man. He was a doctor, an alchemist, and an outstanding pharmacist. One more reason was that Ophelia didn't wish to kill Oros. What would happen if she let Oros live and he left the free city? There would be members of the guild who would inevitably want to follow him. After letting people leave one by one, the free city would end up as a shell of its former self. The guild was a vital part of the free city, especially at a time when the outlaws were expected to leave following Dagon's death. Of course, it wouldn't matter if they had time on their side. There were enough people traveling to the free city to allow them to eventually rebuild the city's power, but there simply wasn't enough time. Like water rising from underfoot, an inevitable danger was quickly approaching. It seems that battle has begun in the west of the region. The wolf demon, Embryo, has clashed with the Western Owners Alliance. A long war would typically be expected, but this is Embryo, who we know has been making aggressive moves. We don't know what variables are in play. While listening to Ophelia's explanation, Yong-ho carefully looked at the map of the southern region. Unlike the other forces that had clashed with Embryo, the Western Owners Alliance wasn't just fighting in a single field. They understood that their strength lay in numbers and had expanded out their front. It was impossible for Embryo to appear in every battle. Even if they lost to Embryo in one battle, they could win in another. In a way, this was a war of attrition. And if it truly was a war of attrition, then Embryo, who had fought repeatedly in recent battles, couldn't help but be at a disadvantage. Is there any chance that Embryo will lose? It exists, and that would be a much better outcome for us. But I'm not sure. With all due respect, Embryo's actions somewhat resemble your own. Yong-ho tilted his head in confusion. Ophelia laughed bitterly. Because, despite the odds, he's winning every fight with overwhelming power. Yong-ho didn't immediately respond to Ophelia's sudden flattery. Ophelia liked that Yong-ho would sometimes show a soft side. She felt that it was a sign of his humanity, considering the length of time that you've been the owner of Mammon's dungeon, and what you've accomplished then. I'm not wrong. And we always have to assume the worst. The worst scenario I can imagine is that Embryo defeats the Western Owners Alliance and still has the power to hit the South. Young-ho nodded. It was an inhumane thought, but the longer the war, the better. The greater the damage between the two sides, the better it was for Young-ho. Now, let's talk about the threats nearby. Some of the outlaws have noticed a change in the Free City, and some are even trying to stage armed protests without prior notice. Is it serious? If Oros hadn't joined use, then it would have been quite a problem. But not anymore. I should be able to handle it on my own. Ophelia smiled with fierce eyes. However, Young-ho liked how she looked. Young-ho pleasantly replied, "You're also outstanding. Thank you, Skull," who was standing in the background, suddenly let out a laugh at the warm atmosphere, and Catalina smiled softly. Ophelia only had one item left to report. Jungcharos' daughter seems to be extremely anxious, although she doesn't yet know that the Free City is in the hands of the House of Mammon. However, the results of the battle with Agares are enough to scare her. If we just leave her be, then there's a high likelihood that she'll surrender to whoever comes down south, whether it's the Western Owners Alliance or Embryo. Didn't you say that she wasn't the type to surrender? She can't just die. Moreover, the divisions within her household are accelerating. Young-ho nodded. The dungeon of the House of Jungcharos was quite far from the House of Mammon, but not the Free City. Young-ho had been so active in the Battle of the Free City that she was right to be afraid. I think it's time to consider staging a dungeon attack. Of course, not immediately, but that didn't mean that it wouldn't be soon. So far, Young-ho had experienced several dungeon battles, but he had never actually attacked a properly guarded dungeon. The fight against Jungcharos' daughter would be the first. When Ophelia's report was over, Young-ho briefly told her what happened during his journey to the east. Ophelia had already confirmed the evolution of Salami, Bucephalus, and Skull Squad, and was now envious of Catalina's development. She wanted to evolve too. She also wanted to become stronger. Young-ho wasn't sure if it was because she was mistress of the pub, but Ophelia seemed to have many different faces. One moment she was a dignified woman. Now she looked like a little girl. He recalled an image he had seen on the internet once, of a boy staring at a trumpet through a glass window. "Shall we, Ophelia? Can I?" "Are you able to evolve me?" Ophelia asked like a little girl. Young-ho nodded. Ophelia had fought 2 battles after joining the House of Mammon and had trained with Eligor dozens of times, which one could interpret as picking on the elderly. Although Ophelia's evolution rate had slowly increased, it was now full. "What do you want to specialize in?" Wait for a moment. Let me think about it." Skull laughed as Ophelia visibly became excited. However, Catalina looked a little strange. She alternated her gaze between Young-ho's and Ophelia's hands with widened eyes, her lips clenched. Young-ho felt her gaze. But why? Perhaps she found it exciting watching from an outside perspective. Young-ho bit his lip and endured his laughter. He looked at Ophelia, who had only just made her decision. "It would be fun to ask if I could touch her tail." Young-ho shook his head. He spoke to Ophelia, whose head was tilted in confusion, and Catalina, who was focusing on them with outstretched ears. "Let's begin. Close your eyes." Ophelia closed her eyes, and Catalina focused even more. Young-ho looked at Ophelia's tail for a moment and reached out his hands. He placed his hands on her shoulders and injected his mana. He invoked Ophelia's evolution. "Give my regards to Brother Eligor." Ophelia had evolved with mana specialization and was now seeing Young-ho off. Young-ho smiled at her affectionate eyes and voice. He wanted to stay in the Free City for a few more days, but he couldn't. He had to go back to the House of Mammon. He had to reassure Eligor, who was waiting for his return, and also evolve Lucia. Furthermore, if Young-ho continued to stay in the Free City, there was the possibility that Jungcharos' daughter would die of a nervous breakdown or make an extreme decision. The former didn't matter, but the latter did. The mad Oros had already made up his mind and didn't have an uneasy attitude in front of Young-ho. Young-ho let go of his worries about Oros because he knew that the talented Ophelia would remain at his side. Young-ho left the Free City and headed back to the House of Mammon. Perhaps because of the thought of going back home, he seemed rather light-footed. The dungeon meerkats, which had evolved into high meerkats, were now able to observe from longer distances than before. After earlier finding out of Yongho's return, Eligor came out to meet him with the rest of the spirits. Yongho was pleased to see all of the spirits greeting him. Yongho felt that he really had returned while facing Eligor, who now resembled more of a middle-aged man rather than an elderly butler. The Goblin Rangers and Spot admired Salami, who had evolved once again with widened eyes, while the Princess Ant, who was always accompanied by Spot, stared at Bucephalus with glistening eyes. She looked just like a cute girl, perhaps because of the dress she was wearing that Catalina had worn as a child. Meanwhile, Rikum and the orcs eagerly inquired about the battle in the Free City. However, Skull Squad couldn't talk, and all Skull could say was Skull. Yongho and Catalina were the only ones that could satiate their curiosity, so they sent pleading eyes to Catalina, who was quite easygoing. Yongho allowed Catalina a short break to reunite with the other spirits. However, that was exactly what she didn't want, as she was dragged away by the orcs led by Rikum. Yongho instead brought along Skull as he headed to the heart of the dungeon. On the way, Lucia made repeated coos and cheers. "I've missed you so much, Master," Lucia cried out as soon as Yongho entered the heart of the dungeon. He couldn't see her, but her voice was enough. Yongho stroked the dungeon's heart as if he was patting her head, and then took out the mana from both Ali's and Yubing's dungeons. Lucia, as always, expressed her feelings with onomatopoeias. Gulp, gulp. In salivating, Jungho understood why the expression spoiled daughter existed. While laughing, Yongho injected the mana into the dungeon's heart, the body of Lucia. Lucia shuddered with excitement. Yongho could feel her soul tremble. The mana of the dungeon has rapidly increased. The dungeon's control is now much stronger. A larger area can now be controlled. A new area has been detected. I only know that it exists, but the area is underground. I can feel the presence of an underground floor. There is even more space on the underground floor than the first floor. Ah. It's so delicious. It's now possible to upgrade existing facilities. I think we can start building a space store now. Ham Master is the best. There was some mixed personal feeling in Lucius' report, but it really was great news. In particular, the last piece of news shook Yongho's heart. "Are you saying that we can start construction of the space door now?" "Yes, Master. Enough mana has been gathered. We don't have the right materials yet, and construction will take a while. But it's still possible." Yongho's happiness was also Lucius' happiness. He tightly clenched his fist. After that pleasant surprise, he once again stroked the dungeon's heart. "Well done. You've done really well, Lucia. Hehehehe. Let's get started right away. I'll transfer some of the spirits involved in other construction work. Please give me permission." While acting a little silly, Lucia projected a window of light in front of Yongho's eyes. It was a list of the spirits in construction and a report on what they were currently doing. Yongho quickly reviewed the information and signed the permission. Lucia spoke again. "Since you've been away for such a long time, I recommended that you should take a really long rest. Only for today. Are you going right back to work tomorrow? You should rest for a little longer. Are you planning on visiting the arena or exploring the second floor? If it's the latter, I can prepare some of the spirits to accompany you." At Lucia's question, Yongho shook his head. He wasn't planning on doing either. "There's a place I have to go." When Yongho spoke, Lucia immediately understood where that place was. "My valuable customer, how can I help you today?" Chapter 94. Return 3. My dearest customer, how can I help you today? As soon as Yongho entered the virtual space of the dungeon market, he heard a voice. As he opened his eyes, Citri greeted him with a bright smile as usual. It was something he experienced every time he saw her, but it truly was stunningly beautiful. Catalina and Ophelia were also beautiful, but they seemed different. While the two of them still felt like people, Citri had the feeling of some sort of mystical being, like an angel or a goddess rather than a person, like a masterpiece or a sculpture created by a master in the pursuit of perfect beauty. But there was natural emotions and expressions added to it. Yongho stared at Citri for a moment, and Citri tilted her head in response to Yongho's slightly different gaze. "My dearest customer, it's been a long time," he responded with a smile. Citri tilted her head again, but only for a moment. She then immediately smiled again and waved her finger. A chair for Yong-ho rose from the floor. There was quite a distance between Yong-ho and Sitri. It was close enough to easily allow a conversation, but it wasn't enough to enable them to reach each other, so Yong-ho was able to see Citra's full body in front of him. Not just her, but the pure white world that she had created. It was because of Gusion. His conversation with Gusion had given him quite a different perspective. Yong-ho consciously buried himself a little more into the back of the chair. Gusion's voice and expression, when talking about Sitri, rang in his head. If she had, or if she had done it a little better, he might not have died. The number of feelings contained within Gusion's words were uncountable. Anger, sorrow, pain, and hatred were all mixed within a single terrifying emotion. Why was Mammon, the king of greed, dead? Why did he suddenly disappear? It's too early. It would be better if you never had to know. Gusion then became silent. He added a few words about Sitri, but he didn't mention again about Mammon's death. Gusion said that Sitri was one of Mammon's women, but it was never that simple. She was one of the two people who could say that they received Mammon's true love. The other, of course, was Elun, the one who cut the night, "I'm not going to hurt you." It sounds strange, but you are the successor. The true successor who has emerged after more than 1,000 years. That was what Gusion had said. Yong-ho woke up from his thoughts and blinked. He almost screamed when he saw how close Citra's face was. He could almost feel her breath. "My dearest customer, are you sick? I don't think that you have a fever." Sitri raised her hand naturally and touched Yong-ho's forehead. It was an indescribable touch. Yong-ho controlled his breathing. He attempted to keep a straight face as he spoke. "I'm a little tired. Here is a list of items that I would like to buy." Sitri squinted her eyes as if she was slightly suspicious, but she accepted the document of light that Yong-ho had formed in the air. Sitri sat down further away to a more suitable distance and reviewed the document of light. Interesting, the purchase list contained the names of various spirits and materials. Among them, Sitri was particularly interested in the materials required to construct the space gate. "Are you planning to construct a space gate?" "Yes, Kaiwan first started to build it. I'm going to finish it." Sitri turned her attention back to the document. Yong-ho looked at Sitri and began to think. Why did Kaiwan try to build a space gate? It took an enormous amount of mana and a considerable amount of material to create it. Yong-ho himself wanted the space gate because he needed to return to Ingi, but what was Kaiwan's reason? By the way, Sitri opened her lips again. She asked with a subtle knowing smile. "Do you clearly know how the space gate works?" What Yong-ho asked unknowingly. Instead of immediately answering, Sitri just expressed that she knew something. The space gate that Yong-ho knew was a two-way connection between two places. It was a passageway to return to Ingi, Yong-ho's hometown, a device that can freely create doors in space, which Catalina and Eligor previously opened incompletely. "Don't look like that. If you complete the space gate, you'll be able to open a door back to Ingiba. It's a little tougher than you might think." Sitri waved her hand. One of the items in the document of light expanded and spread out within the air. "This material is currently not in stock in the southern branch, although I think there's some extra in my private warehouse, but it's my own private collection." Yong-ho's mind felt complicated. Was it because of what Sitri had said about the supply of materials? It wasn't. It was about something else she had said, and also what he had said. Yong-ho stretched his shoulders. "Is there anything that you want from me?" Sitri smiled brightly. Then, once again, narrowed the distance between them and spoke. "Tell me, what happened in the Free City? I heard that you defeated Agares." Sitri was interested in Yong-ho himself. There was always a deep goodwill in her eyes. Was it because, as Gusion had said, that Yong-ho was Mammon's true successor? "I don't know anything else, but it's clear that she was in love with Master. At least I believe so." That's what Elun had said. Yong-ho recalled Gusion's voice again and then closed and opened his eyes. He began to talk about his experiences in the Free City as lightly as possible. Sitri was a good listener. She always gave a good response when it was required. Yong-ho seemed to be skilled at bringing the story to life. That's how it happened. After finishing the story, Yong-ho exhaled a long breath. Although all he had done was talk, he now felt very tired. Sitri showed a gentle smile. Instead of expressing her thoughts, she buried herself deeply into her chair and for a moment her lips parted and smiled like a young girl. I think we should keep our last promise. Do you remember what I said last time, where I said that you should experience more of the world? He couldn't forget it. Young-ho nodded. You mean the auction house? Yes, the auction house, a gathering place for many powerful people. There's an auction 2 days later, so the timing is great. What do you think? Would you like to participate? Citrus Beauty always caused him to be nervously tense, so he didn't immediately accept. He felt a bit out of shape, but he asked what it would take. Is there anything like an entry fee? An amount that should be paid to the auction house in advance? He asked, since he'd once read about an high-end auction house from a novel when he was younger. Citri laughed loudly. There is, but I'll exempt you. That's what I promised. From what you're saying, I presume you've accepted. Citri stood up from her seat. She lowered herself in front of Young-ho's knees. She looked up at him and asked, to the master of the great house of Mammon, would you give me the honor of placing my lips to the back of your hand? Although the typical position of man and woman had changed, Young-ho quickly reached out the back of his hand. Citri gently held Young-ho's fingertips and placed her lips on the back of his hand. The softness of her lips felt like melting snow, quickly followed by a dizzying heat. Think of it as an admission ticket. It's your first time, so I'll escort you. A pale red crest appeared on the back of Young-ho's hand. It was the familiar symbol of the dungeon market. One person can accompany you. You up at night in 2 days' time, so I'll see you then. I'll also ship your order. Citri went back to her seat, and, as if it were a sign, the whole white world around him collapsed. The connection to the virtual space had been lost. Just as he promised to Lucia, Young-ho took a rest. However, it was only 1 day, in fact, just half a day. As soon as the next morning dawned, Young-ho began to start the work that he had postponed, perhaps because of the trouble with the orcs, who were led by Rikum all day, or simply due to his current low blood pressure. He began to meet with all the ministers, along with Catalina, who had started to doze off. The purpose of these meetings were listen to the grievances and hardships of each spirit and improve their working conditions. But the main purpose was different. It was the evolution of the spirits. Young-ho didn't just value Skull and the other main combat spirits. The spirits guarding the dungeons such as Rikum, the orcs, and the Treant were also very precious to him. Without the Goblin Rangers and Bergrim, Mammon's dungeon wouldn't be able to operate as efficiently. While Young-ho advanced his evolution rate through warfare, the spirits who remained in the dungeon also increased their evolution rate in their own way. For the spirits of the House of Mammon, training at the spirits' training ground was now routine. Among the spirits, the Goblin Rangers, who were now considered the seniors, had evolved to take advantage of their strengths. John had strength, Ron had stamina, Yon had agility, and June had her intellect. It had been proven time and time again that the power of evolution had a certain amount of power to change aspects of one's appearance. The Goblin Rangers differed from the usual hobgoblins. Not just their face, but their actual body shape now resembled more like a human. Rikum and the other orcs also benefited from the power of evolution. Unlike the other orcs, Rikum specialized in endurance. If Rikum were to continue to grow, he might evolve into an orc emperor, the top orc warrior. It took Young-ho a long time to meet each spirit. HISC wasn't an infinite resource, so he was eager to rest. However, he couldn't just that he was done for the day, especially with faced with earnest look of his spirits. It was now Bergrim's turn. After the orcs evolved, he had been waiting for his turn with longing eyes, and he now finally stood in front of Young-ho. He was nervous, but his face was hardened. Lucia whispered to Young-ho. Since his first evolution, he has been devoted to his work. Currently, there is not a single thing within Mammon's dungeon that hasn't been touched by his hands. He almost lived within the training grounds. Young-ho understood why Bergrim was so nervous. Only Young-ho himself could see the evolution rate. From Bergrim's position, it wasn't possible to know how much his evolution rate had progressed and how long it would take to fill up. It was best for him to just continue to train and work in silence. How frustrating and irritable it must have been. Still, it was a relief. Bergrim's evolution rate was now completely full. Young-ho spoke to Bergrim. Well done. Close your eyes and stand still. Bergrim had been watching the meetings from behind all this time. Bergrim tightly closed his eyes and gulped. Yong-ho placed his hand on Bergrim's forehead and invoked the power of evolution. Once again, he evolved the mana attribute. Suddenly, there was a reaction. Yong-ho felt Bergrim's mana. It was very small, but it was clearly pulsating. Bergrim's mana pool had been reborn. Bergrim also felt it. He began to shed tears unknowingly. It was a feeling that he had thought he would never feel again, but now he felt it. It felt like a light in the darkness, although it was small. It was like a dazzling star. Bergrim knelt on the floor. He kowtowed to Yong-ho several times in a row. Yong-ho raised him up. He ordered him to go back and rest since he was currently overwhelmed with emotion. Now we can create magical equipment. Equipment, town, congratulations, master. It was as Lucia had said. However, Yong-ho didn't feel much joy in that fact. It was because now that Bergrim had recovered his mana, he had now regained his purpose in life, which caused Yong-ho to feel far more profound. Yong-ho happily sat down on his throne. He then began to talk with Uria and Spot, who approached him after being surprised by the weeping Bergrim. The evolution of Spot was simple, but Uria's evolution was not so easy. This was because he wanted to give her the characteristics absorbed by Agares. In the end, Yong-ho couldn't help but have a break. And, by the evening, with the last spirit in front of him, Yong-ho finally had a smile on his face. Ah. Master Eligor faced Yong-ho's smile with shaking eyes. Unlike the other spirits, Yong-ho didn't have to wonder how to evolve Eligor. After evolving into the red demon beast, Eligor had also worked hard. Even in the absence of Ophelia, he had continually cultivated his martial arts. Yong-ho spoke with a natural expression. Eligor's evolution route was set out by Ophelia. You want to evolve your stamina. You're still weak in your lower back and lower body. Oh, and Ophelia says hello. There wasn't any choice. Eligor fondly remembered Ophelia, who had first twisted his arm and then kindly called him brother. He gently closed his eyes and accepted the power of evolution. Another day had passed. For the first time since absorbing Agares' spirit, Yong-ho, who had exhausted all his mana, slept in, while Catalina, who had also overslept, rejoiced in her bliss. There was no exaggeration to say that the person to accompany Yong-ho to the auction house had been decided from the beginning. Yong-ho, who was dressed in a sharp demon suit, one of the few heirlooms of the Mammon family, looked around. Just like when he had first met her, Catalina wore a beautiful dress and tried to look cool, as if she was attempting to go back to that time. People from the dungeon market have arrived in front of the dungeon's entrance. It was the news they were waiting for. Yong-ho, who was already waiting in the entrance room, took a deep breath. He looked around at Catalina again. Shall we go? Yes, master. As Yong-ho waved his hand, Lucia opened the entrance to the dungeon. They were greeted with the spilling moonlight, just as it was a long time ago, in the age of the King of Greed. Chapter 95. The Dungeon Market's Auction House. The night sky of the demon world was overwhelming in a different sense than the daytime. There wasn't a dazzling harmony of brilliant colors. Instead, a heavy blue, close to black, covered the sky. The darkness looked as if it was made to be cold and heavy. The horizon couldn't be distinguished as the darkness melted from the heavens to the earth. Starlight cascaded down, and beyond, the white moon shone. The moon was brighter in the dark. However, it never pushed the darkness away. The moonlight was in harmony with the darkness, as it conveyed warmth in the coolness of the dark. And now they stood under such moonlight. Yong-ho now understood what it was like to be breathless, even though it was just for a moment. Citri was beautiful enough to disturb someone's mind, even if they had a clear mindset. It seemed that Citri knew this and purposely cultivated her own beauty. Moreover, she now stood under the dazzling moonlight. Catalina wasn't that much different from Yong-ho. The fact that she was a woman didn't matter. Citri smiled gently as she met them. Her naturally flowing white dress was reminiscent of a moon goddess. Time froze. There was power in Citri's beauty. However, there was one that kept calm even amidst the still time. There was one who was not dazzled by the beauty of Citri, but merely looked calmly at it. Amon. Citri spoke with her eyes. Amon didn't respond. His body was currently in the form of a bracelet on Yong-ho's right arm. Mammons. 12 spirits each had different feelings for Citri. For Elune, the one who cuts the night, it was a love-hate relationship. For Gusion the strong, it was resentment. And for Amon, the red lotus demon lance, it was sympathy. His feelings were a mix of fondness and sadness. Citri still had a small smile, but it was cracked. Some of her deepest feelings, hidden within her heart, were revealed. However, her emotions only wavered ever so slightly. Citri's beauty was like the moonlight, which conveniently covered her emotions, which, in comparison, were like fireflies. "My dearest customer, it's time for our appointment." Her voice was gentle. Her red hair was slightly raised, so the curve of her white neck was clearly revealed. Yong-ho took a deep breath. He lightly held the stunned Catalina's frozen hand and gave her a smile. He then gently pulled her hand and headed towards Citri. Citri looked at Yong-ho and Catalina with a warm expression. As they walked closer, she bowed gracefully and then waved her hand. She pulled 2 masks out of thin air and held them out to Yong-ho and Catalina. "This is an anonymous auction. You don't have to wear it right now, but you'll have to wear it once you enter the venue." Yong-ho's mask was just a plain white mask with no shape or pattern, like the one from the Phantom of the Opera. It was cut off at the lower half beneath the nose, exposing the mouth and chin. The mask that Catalina received also exposed the lower part of her nose, but it was rather colorful and looked like a butterfly, with rainbow colors harmoniously blending in with the large black wings. While Citri was giving an explanation to Yong-ho, other things were going on. The dungeon market courier, dressed in an all-white costume, delivered the package to Eligor. After looking down at his mask for a moment, Yong-ho looked back at Citri. He was curious about Citri's mask. Yong-ho didn't know where the auction was going to be held, how long it would take to get there, or how he was going to get there. If Gusion hadn't told him that Citri was Mammon's woman, then he would have never accompanied her, no matter how good their relationship was. If you thought about it, she's basically an old lady. It would be natural for someone to be stunned by that revelation, but it wasn't something that Yong-ho would mention. Yong-ho smiled unknowingly, and Citri tilted her head slightly in response. "My dearest customer, it's nothing." He took a deep breath again. He remembered. Citri wasn't the guardian of the House of Mammon. She had ignored the 2 previous owners and didn't provide any decisive help to Kaiwan. It was the same for Yong-ho. She did show him favoritism, but only through slightly indirect help. Of course, if he thought about things such as the mana recovery potions given to him by Citri, then it wasn't all small. However, when he fought Foraz or Agarez, Citri was just a bystander. "All right, let's get started. We have a long way to go." Citri took a step back and clapped her hands while looking at Yong-ho. Catalina was the first to notice something strange in the sky as she widely opened her mouth. Yong-ho also lightly exclaimed. A carriage began to descend from the night sky amidst the moonlight. The white wagon was without a roof and looked incredibly beautiful, but Yong-ho and Catalina saw something other than the wagon. Dozens of cats running through the night sky. What Citri had prepared was a cat carriage. Freya, the goddess of magic and beauty from northern European mythology, was said to have traveled through the night sky in a cat carriage to keep her promise with Odin. It was her mission to spread the seeds of chaos all over the world to create Einherjars, the warriors of the gods, for the last war. The cat carriage raced through the night sky. For Yong-ho, this was a completely new experience because he had never flown through the night sky with salami moonlight and starlight. Mana flowed through the blue darkness. The wind slapped his cheeks. The cat carriage was faster than salami. The starlight turned from a point into a line and then soon became indistinguishable from the darkness. It wasn't physically fast. The cat carriage seemed to leap through space. In an instant, it seemed to magically leap over a vast distance. When the starlight regained its shape, the cat carriage began its descent that seemed close to falling. The thrill, as if he was riding a roller coaster, caused his whole body to tighten up. Fortunately, it didn't last long. When they landed on the ground, Citri was the first one to step out of the cat carriage, followed closely by Yong-ho and Catalina. As soon as the 3 of them got off, the surrounding landscape quickly transformed, while the cat carriage returned to the sky unnoticed. They had only taken a few steps before the place where they stood suddenly transformed from a white desert into a cozy wooden corridor. Despite the reality in front of him, Yong-ho felt like he was accessing the virtual space of the dungeon market. Citri took another few steps forward. She turned around in front of the door at the end of the hallway and faced Yong-ho while wearing her own mask. Unlike Yong-ho and Catalina, her mask was in the shape of a lioness that covered her entire face. Beyond this door is the auction house of the dungeon market, led by Samael, the fastest wings, one of the 5 directors of the dungeon market. Please put on your mask. Yong-ho put on his mask, which helped to calm his agitated mind and was a symbol of anonymity. My dearest customer, didn't I tell you that I would let you experience greater things? The lioness mask completely obscured Citra's face. She grabbed the doorknob. Please, don't feel overwhelmed. The door opened with a pleasing sound. And then Yong-ho realized the meaning of what Citri said about experiencing greater things. Beyond the door was a banquet hall for the giants. The moment the door opened, the air changed. Unbearable weight suffocated his whole body. It reflexively conjured up past memories. When he had first met Amon. When Amon and Gusion clashed with each other. However, this was different. This was a completely different kind of pressure from that time. It was like a whirlwind. Dozens of giant pools of mana collided and tangled together, creating a complex stream of mana. Not just one, but several, forming a dense, suffocating tightness. There was no such absoluteness from Amon, however, the mana was indifferent. The streams of mana seemed to be tanged up at random. Yong-ho attempted to draw out his mana. He tried to resist the raging mana, but Citri shook her head, as if to say, not to do that. For what reason? How come? Yong-ho clenched his teeth, and then he realized that Citri was just standing there naturally. And so were the many people behind the door. They didn't concentrate their mana. They just radiated it naturally, and the emanating mana tangled together created the current heaviness. Ophelia had previously said that 4 horns indicated the strength of one of the pillars of the southern region. However, if you talked about the whole demon world, then it was only enough to be slightly influential. It was ridiculous to compare the number of demons in the southern region to the number of demons that existed throughout the entire demon world. What kind of beings existed beyond his horizon? How many horns do they have? How much power do they possess? Yong-ho didn't forcefully draw out his mana. He accepted the weight he endured and took another deep breath. Of course, it was still overwhelming, but he tried to get used to it. He was not afraid of the new world before him. The real reason Citri had brought Yong-ho to the auction house was this: to remind him of the fact that skies exist beyond skies, to show Yong-ho what kind of world he would be venturing into in the future. The significance of this auction was the attendance itself. How much time has passed? Having just barely regained his ability to look around, Yong-ho heard harsh breathing coming from Catalina. The burden was heavy even for Yong-ho, who had 4 horns. The weight felt by Catalina, who had 3 horns, was several times greater. Catalina endured the pressure. It was thanks to Gusion. If she hadn't tasted Gusion's overwhelming pressure in the arena, she would have likely passed out. Yong-ho grabbed Catalina's hand. Even in the midst of hardship, he shared his mana. Catalina's breath suddenly became calmer. Citri quietly looked at him. She then swept aside the magical curtain that obscured the beings beyond the door. Come this way, I'll show you to your seats. Citri did not protect Yong-ho and Catalina, as Amon had done. She took a turn and led them to their seats, while Yong-ho followed behind alongside Catalina to keep her from falling behind. The area beyond the door was magnificent. It reminded Yong-ho of a grand ballroom scene seen in movies. There was those who gathered together and chatted, while there were those who stood in secluded spots and quietly observed their surroundings. Citri walked slowly, which allowed Yong-ho to be able to take a look around. Masks covered the faces of all of the participants. However, he knew that they were demons. There were many characteristics that could be used to identify an opponent, such as skin, body shape, and unusual features. However, Yong-ho lacked any information in the first place. Instead of trying to forcibly identify clues, he could simply feel the participants and their natural aura. A few minutes had now passed since they had walked through the door. Yong-ho realized that the mana that filled the banquet hall wasn't natural. Most of the participants tightly controlled their mana. Concealing the color and attributes of one's mana was one of the very basics. Even the mana that was exhaled with their breathing had been finely tuned. No, that's not it. It was clear to Yong-ho that such coordination was almost entirely done at a subconscious level. Their level of mana control was unparalleled compared to the foes that Yong-ho had encountered before. This was true for all of the participants. When the door was first opened, an abnormal shock pierced Yong-ho's back. It took his breath away. Instead of controlling his breathing, he tried to control his mana. It was impossible to do it like the other attendees right now, but he tried anyway. He erased the color and attributes of his mana. However, he didn't forget to act in conjunction with Catalina's mana. Yong-ho felt like he was walking naked inside a storm. Sweat began to secrete from his hand that was holding Catalina's. Time passed by extremely slowly. A single moment seemed to split into dozens or hundreds of equal lengths. And when he took a step forward, Yong-ho suddenly turned his head. It was an inexplicable impulse. Greed had guided his action, but it was different from usual. At the end of his gaze, a large man came into view. The man was also looking at Yong-ho, his face obscured with a terrifying ghost mask. As soon as Yong-ho turned his head, their gazes instantly collided. The slow passage of time suddenly came to a standstill. The man was a considerable distance away, but it felt meaningless. Why? What did Greed feel in that man, dearest customer? This way, Citrus' voice broke the frozen time. She didn't even look at the man. The moment Yong-ho heard Citrus' voice, he was able to free himself from the man's gaze. Master, Catalina spoke, and Yong-ho squeezed her hand once again in response. He smiled at the bottom of his mask and followed Citri into the auction house. He could still feel the man's gaze. But Yong-ho didn't look back. Master, a woman in a parrot mask called to the man wearing the ghost mask in a quiet voice. Instead of directly responding to the woman's call, the man in the ghost mask squinted his eyes. He was now picturing the small black-haired man who was now out of sight. He was so inexperienced that he even struggled with the air of the auction house. But why it bothered him? It wasn't just a hunch. Master, nothing. Let's go. The woman in the parrot mask looked perplexed at her master, but she soon regained her composure. She guided her master with a gentle gesture. One of the 6 kings who ruled the demon world, the king of gluttony, took a step forward. Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin today's auction. The first item for auction today is the champion of the world, Azran, Chapter 96. Dungeon Market's Auction House. 2 Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin today's auction. The first item for sale is Azran, the champion of the world. The inside of this auction house was like an opera house. There was a large stage in the center with seats all around it. However, the shape of the seats was a little different from normal. There were clusters of 2 to 4 seats connected together, and gaps between each cluster. Is this an advancement of couple seats in theaters? Yong-ho briefly recalled a theater where he worked for a short time. It was similar, but different. The auction house looked more akin to the end-of-year award ceremonies on TV. Citri led Yong-ho to a spot in the center of the hall. In that spot was a long sofa with a long table beside it, adorned with the number 27. This man bravely attacked the dungeon of the King of Violence. Although the King of Violence showed mercy, the very fact that this man survived is a testament to his value. The auction continued while Yong-ho was looking for a seat. Citri silently sat on the left-hand side of the sofa, while Yong-ho, still holding Catalina's left hand with his right, hesitated for a moment before sitting beside her. Naturally, Catalina sat next to Yong-ho on the right side of the sofa. There was enough space between Yong-ho and Citri to fit another person, which was quite a striking difference from Catalina, who closely sat next to him. It seemed to naturally symbolize Yong-ho's distance from Citri, which had not yet been filled. Citri didn't mind, however, and Yong-ho, who had now sat down, was finally able to look at the stage. As a champion, he's got talents in many areas. He's a powerful prosecutor, a wizard, and an outstanding tactician. He truly is a jack of all trades. Although he is excellent as he is, he'll still be able to perform satisfactorily, even if you resurrect him as an undead. The auction was held by a man wearing an elephant mask. It was truly bizarre. Other than the mask, the only thing the man wore was a well-dressed suit, but for some reason he looked very attractive. It was the first time Yong-ho had ever felt this way about a man, rather than a woman. So he suddenly felt quite agitated. Whether Citri had been able to discern Yong-ho's feelings or not, she spoke in a quiet voice. That's the incubus, Rod Carrot. One of Samael's henchmen. He's a dangerous person who can attract others subconsciously. Be careful, because his seduction works on both men and women. Citri finished talking with a smile. Yong-ho thought he could pay back Citri, but he decided not to mention it. Instead, he focused on the auction again. The man in the elephant mask, the incubus Rod Carrot, stood next to the champion Azran. He looked like an ordinary man in appearance. He had murky blonde hair, which was quite common, and was of an average size. Yong-ho examined the warrior more closely. He soon realized that his eyes were dead. It was as if his eyes had begun to decay. There was no light left in his gray eyes, which were now closer to black. It wasn't his figure or appearance that didn't match his fancy armor. It was his eyes. Yong-ho thought of Bergrim. He had lost all hope in life and was barely alive. Yong-ho fantasized what must have happened in his mind. He would not have attacked the king of violence alone, so he must have had companions. What happened to those companions? Had they all died? Was he in despair because he had been taken to this strange world and enslaved? That's it for the introduction. Let us now begin. The starting price is 5,000. It was enough money to purchase hundreds of lower-class spirits. Yong-ho cleared away his useless delusions and looked at Azran objectively. Even within this auction house, Yong-ho did not fight the surging tide of mana. He naturally invoked the power of evolution. Name: Azran M. Race, Human. Strength, Level 4-3 Decession. Stamina, Level 4-3 Decession. Mana, Level 7-3-5 Decession. Skill, Level 6-3-5. Since he wasn't one of Yong-ho's spirits, he could only see a rough amount of information, but Yong-ho felt both admiration and disappointment. Azran, the champion, was the highest level of existence that Yong-ho had examined to date. However, he didn't have much potential for evolution. Yong-ho suddenly turned to his side. Catalina's breath was calm. It was an incredibly quick adaptation, even despite Yong-ho's resonating mana. Yong-ho had 4 horns, while Catalina only had 3. The difference was huge. If considering the absolute amount of mana possessed, it was clear that Catalina had less than half of Yong-ho's. Nevertheless, Catalina was able to successfully adapt to the flow of mana within the auction house. She protected herself by gently passing on the mana swirling around her. Come to think of it, aside from Armon, who degraded himself, Catalina had by far the most potential out of all of Yong-ho's spirits. She had a potential of 4 stars, which even the warrior Azran did not have. And even her lowest potential was 3.5 stars, which was comparable to Azran. Catalina was a shiny gemstone. The beauty and value of the cut would be dependent on the method of cutting. Master Catalina noticed Yong-ho's gaze and asked him quietly. Yong-ho responded as if it was nothing, and then lifted the power of evolution. The champion Azran was auctioned off to a man wearing a dragon mask. The auction continued. Like Azran, there were times when a person came up for sale, and there were also times when mysterious artifacts came up as well. Yong-ho enjoyed the auction in his own way. When people came up for sale, he examined their potential with the power of evolution, and when items came up, he evaluated them with the power of greed. It was important for him to expand his understanding of the world and fill in gaps in his knowledge. Time passed. The 13th item now came up to the stage. You may think of this as a short break. This is the cursed crown of Einkel. The small crown was placed on top of a cart, pushed by a woman in a bunny mask. The crown, made out of pure metal, was not only worn, but was also covered in damage, as if it had been poorly kept. Carrot subsequently gave details about the crown. His explanation was so frivolous that it felt like the only reason for it was for people to just have a break. Even the curse of the crown felt mischievous. However, Yong-ho swallowed dry saliva. Carrot's explanation wasn't heard. Greed raised its voice. But it was different from before. Greed had always been obsessed with value. It pointed Yong-ho to its desire. However, greed did not point to the crown. It stretched out its branches everywhere except for the crown. Nevertheless, Yong-ho felt a deep coveting feeling towards it. Greed was the same. It was saying that he needed to get his hands on the crown, even though it didn't stretch out its branches towards it. It was an unknown sensation. It had never been like this before. No, was that really the case? Had this sensation really never been felt before? There had been a similar sensation, but that just made it even more incomprehensible. Just before entering the main auction house, he had encountered a man wearing a ghostly mask. When his eyes met with his, it was similar to the sensation that he felt at that time. Obviously, it wasn't entirely the same, but he felt similarities. The price starts at 100. Carrot's voice broke through his mind. Yong-ho reflexively looked at Sitri, and Sitri gently greeted Yong-ho's gaze, as if she knew that he would look at her. Yong-ho was embarrassed by Sitri's gaze, but only for a moment. Instead of hesitating, he asked in a slightly urgent tone, "I'll pay for it as soon as I return." "Could you lend me the money?" Sitri responded with a smile. Instead of talking to Yong-ho about Gatabuta to say that something is right or wrong, she raised her long, slender finger to participate in the auction. Few coveted the crown, as evidenced by its frivolous sale in the first place. Even so, after Citrus' bid became a little too high, all the other potential bidders eventually disappeared entirely. The final bid was 500. He couldn't afford to be extravagant, but he was able to cover this amount. Yong-ho, who prayed whenever the price went up, breathed out a sigh of relief. After Yong-ho managed to regain his tranquility, Sitri spoke. "Then, shall we go back now? You've now had plenty of experience in the higher skies. Your guard has crossed a threshold, and you also got an item that you wanted." When Sitri mentioned that his guard had crossed a threshold, Yong-ho hurriedly looked at Catalina. Catalina blinked as if she was wondering what Sitri was talking about, but quickly understood. It was the same for Yong-ho. Catalina's mana control had noticeably improved from before entering the auction house. Yong-ho's mana control had improved as well. But if one were to compare them, Catalina's improvement was clearly superior. "Thank you. Well, I just kept my promise." Sitri responded gently to Yong-ho's thanks, and then stood up first. She then naturally led Yong-ho and Catalina out, as she had done with them when they entered. It was almost near the end of the auction when the King of Gluttony entered the auction house. The King of Gluttony felt rather satisfied, as his secret deal with Samael had been quite successful. The woman in the parrot mask politely handed over the catalogue to the King of Gluttony. It was a catalogue of the items that were auctioned off today. The catalogue did not simply just contain pictures or descriptions. The catalogue recorded specific moments with mana, making it possible for the reader to get a vivid feel of the item. The King of Gluttony suddenly stopped, as he was turning one of the pages with a light touch. The woman in the parrot mask, who was focusing on the King of Gluttony, asked in a quiet, graceful voice, "Master, have you found anything of interest?" The King of Gluttony did not answer. He just stared at the catalogue. Instead of repeating her words, the woman in the parrot mask peeked at the catalogue. On the page when the King of Gluttony's hand had stopped was the listing of the cursed crown of Einkel. It was a small enough item to be a children's toy. The curse of the crown also seemed rather crude. Nevertheless, the King of Gluttony continued to stare at it. He stared at the item for a long time, then spoke in a low tone. "Who won this item?" That was the King of Gluttony's question. However, the woman in the parrot mask could not answer. In the case of an anonymous auction, the dungeon market never divulged the buyer's information. "Please wait a moment." The woman in the parrot mask stood up after barely being able to squeeze out an answer. Now that this was the case, she had to figure out which masked attendee had won the crown. If she were to ask that question from on the auctioneers, she would at least be able to know what they looked like. When the woman in the parrot mask left, the King of Gluttony exhaled a long breath. He reached out and touched the image of the crown floating in the air. The curse of the crown was crude. The shape of the crown was also of little value, but the metal that made up the crown, ordinary people were unable to recognize it. Even for discerning blacksmiths, it was difficult to appreciate the true value of the metal. But the King of Gluttony knew. It wasn't because he had a good eye. The power of gluttony was telling him, the great ancient power was shouting, 7 deadly sins. 7 sins. A fragment of the great demon king's soul, a portion of the highest existence. 7 miracles. A fragment of the great demon king's flesh, and the mysterious fragments. Dozens. Hundreds of them. The metal that made up that crown was one of those mysterious fragments. But even so, it was a fragment of the body of the great demon king god's metal. Yes, what other expression would suit such a metal? The king of gluttony was a meticulous man. He asked himself, did the buyer recognize the true worth of the crown? Perhaps he just bought the crown for his own amusement. It didn't matter if it was for just personal amusement. But if that was not the case, then would he have recognized the true nature of the crown? No, it can't be. The only king inside the auction house was the king of gluttony himself. If there was another king, then he would have known. All 6 existing kings were kings that the king of gluttony had personally met and competed against. But why? Why did he have such an awkward feeling? The king of gluttony waited for the woman in the parrot mask to return. And suddenly he recalled a man, a young man wearing a white mask that he had encountered before the auction began. The king of gluttony shook his head. He turned the pages of the catalogue in the hope that it was just an unfounded fear. Thank you very much for today. Yong-ho climbed off of the cat carriage and thanked Citri. It seemed like they had been away for a long time, but the night was still not yet over. The dawn was still far away. Citri laughed. She gazed at Yong-ho with affectionate eyes. I'm also happy when my beloved customer improves. Just think of it as something I did for myself, and… Citri suddenly stopped talking. She squinted her eyes and smiled. You look sweet together, but can't you let go now? Yong-ho blinked, but soon understood. He glanced at Catalina's hand, which he had still been holding ever since they had left the auction house, and returned to Mammon's dungeon. Catalina became flustered, causing her ears to begin to flap. Yong-ho became startled and quickly let go. Both of her ears were bright red. Citri did not tease the two of them with silence. Instead, she took the crown out from between her breasts and held it out to Yong-ho. Here's the crown. You have a good eye. Was that just a joke, or was the crown really worth something? While Yong-ho was contemplating on it, Citri took a step back. You should go in. Eligor will be waiting for you. He didn't know about Eligor, but the high meerkats had just woken up and were now watching them. Yong-ho nodded. He first gave Citri a farewell. I'll see you next time, then. Yes, you too. I look forward to seeing you again. Citri also gave her farewell in return. Catalina bowed her head after briefly pondering how to say goodbye. Yong-ho and Catalina then headed side by side back to Mammon's dungeon. Citri looked at them from the back and wore a lonely smile upon her face. She climbed back onto the cat carriage. The figure of Yong-ho, with Catalina standing next to him, reminded her of Mammon, and Alun. Citri reminisced for a long time as the cat carriage flew through the night sky. She sang in a quiet voice as dawn approached Mammon. The great king of greed, the only man the Citri had ever loved. And Citri looked down at her hand. She bit her lips without realizing it. She remembered what she wanted to forget, but couldn't, more than 1,000 years ago, the day the Mammon disappeared from this world. Citri clenched her fist. She held the same hand to her chest that had taken Mammon's life. Once again, she called out Mammon's name, but there was no answer. Only a watery voice hovered in the dark night sky. Visit and read more novel to help us update chapter quickly. Thank you so much. Chapter 97, The Door of Space. The Cursed Crown of Einkel. After speaking out loud, Yong-ho put down the brochure he had received from the auction house. He naturally looked at the crown. There wasn't much information in the brochure, the name and origin of the crown, and an outline of the legend behind it. The first owner of the crown was King Einkel, who was said to be from the eastern part of the demon world. There was a legend that said that anyone with the crown at their bedside would be visited by nightmares. Unlike tinnitus, it was a legend, not a definitive curse, since there were those who did not receive nightmares, despite having the crown on their bedside. According to the Dungeon Market's brochure, some people may not even have nightmares at all, while others who did would only have a couple of them. It was like a child's toy. It could be dangerous if one had a fatal nightmare, but that wasn't necessarily going to be the case. Although it differed person to person, it would probably only cause one to recall the most shameful things in life. It was a crown that reminded him of one of the penalties of the lower floors of Mammon's arena. Yong-ho carefully lifted the crown. He could definitely feel the mana, albeit weakly. It wasn't something that greed would covet. However, Yong-ho didn't give up easily. Although he was a major in computer engineering, he decided to experiment with a variety of methods. Yong-ho concentrated mana into both of his hands. There was no response from the crown. Yong-ho repeatedly invoked the power of evolution. He closely looked at the crown, but no letters of light appeared. It was too early to give up. Yong-ho aroused greed. As always, smoke that was only visible to Yong-ho appeared. Greed began to stretch out in all directions, as if searching for a place to go, and soon began to raise its voice. It was just like in the auction house. Except there was one thing that was different. The crown was now in Yong-ho's hands. It wasn't far away. Like in the auction house, Greed headed towards the crown. The smoke wound around Yong-ho's hands as well as the crown. What happened next was purely instinctual. Yong-ho instinctively aroused his mana. Green mana, blooming like flames, began to concentrate in both of his hands. Greed and mana became one. Yong-ho infused his mana into greed. It was a combination he had never even thought of trying. The results of such a combination were truly magnificent. His mana had been amplified. However, it didn't stop there. His mana was being tempered. Greed elevated Yong-ho's mana to a higher level. Yong-ho breathed out roughly. The flow of mana was too fast. Moreover, it flowed roughly like the galloping of a wild horse. It was clear that if it had only been a few days ago, Yong-ho would not have been able to control it. But that wasn't the case now. Experience from the auction house now made it possible. Yong-ho took the reins of the galloping wild horse. He turned the runaway horse into a race. And instinct dictated. Yong-ho infused the new mana into the crown held in his hands. The crown did not explode. It didn't even melt into the unruly mana. The crown responded. It accepted Yong-ho's mana as if it had been waiting. Store amplify. Respond. Yong-ho recognized the true essence of the crown. The current reaction wasn't because of some special magic on the crown. It was the power of the metal itself that made up the crown. It was only then that he understood greed wasn't craving like usual. Instead, it was resonating with the metal that made up the crown. How could this be? What kind of metal resonated with greed, one of these 7 deadly sins? Yong-ho put aside the currently unsolvable questions and exclaimed at the idea that suddenly came to his mind. He yelled, "Catalina, master!" At Lucius' call, Catalina rushed towards Yong-ho and blinked at the sight of the cut crown. It was Yong-ho who cut the crown. Instead of explaining to Catalina, Yong-ho returned Aemon, who was currently emitting a high temperature, to his bracelet form and handed one of the pieces of the crown to Catalina. "Hold it." For a dungeon spirit, the order of the owner was absolute. Catalina faced Yong-ho, holding a piece of the crown. Yong-ho took a step back. After opening up a reasonable distance from Catalina, he gave her another command. "Arouse your mana." Catalina bit her lips, but soon did as Yong-ho ordered. Black mana arose. Yong-ho felt Catalina's mana. Realizing the connection between owner and spirit, he also aroused his own mana. It wasn't his ordinary mana. Greed and mana covered the fragment of the crown in his hands. Soon, a strange reaction occurred that Yong-ho was hoping for. The piece of the crown held by Catalina suddenly responded. Despite not touching Yong-ho's mana, it showed the exact same reaction as the piece held in Yong-ho's own hands. And then again, as expected, Catalina's mana was amplified. The power of greed partly infused with Catalina's black mana. Catalina was stunned at the sudden amplification of her mana, but that wasn't the only thing that surprised her. She felt Yong-ho within her amplified mana. Catalina focused. She controlled the mana that began to run wild and made it her own. She had also experienced the auction house, so she too was able to control it. It was like a well-forged blade. The attributes of Catalina's black mana also became stronger. Yong-ho understood. It was originally just a crown, so there was no connection between the two pieces. Instead, it was himself and Catalina who were connected. The current phenomenon occurred because he, the owner, was conscious of his connection with Catalina. The dungeon spirit Catalina did not possess the power of a sin, but Yong-ho was able to use the power of the crown to amplify his own sin. The power of sin that was amplified was then transmitted to Catalina, and the crown piece that Catalina was holding reacted to that power, inducing Yong-ho's desired response. Store, amplify, and respond. Still, the identity of the metal was unknown. However, the use of the metal was not. All that remained was to find a more efficient way to utilize it. Catalina. Yes, Master. Catalina looked at Yong-ho anticipating an explanation. However, Young-ho said something entirely unexpected. "Let's go find Bergrim." Catalina was unable to ask any questions, as she was busy chasing after Young-ho, who had swiftly exited the room in the blink of an eye. Young-ho wasn't the only one in Mammon's dungeon with glistening eyes. After recovering some of his mana, Bergrim began to make magical gear like crazy, as if to show what the madness of a craftsman was really like. Of course, his mana was still too weak. There was no shortage of materials that would digest his mana. But still, Bergrim utilized his mana. He had begun to make new dishware for the kitchen. Strong spoons and forks had been mass-produced. The knives and ladles could even temporarily be used as combat weapons. Bergrim, who was currently making iron chopsticks for Young-ho with all his heart and soul, suddenly jumped up from his seat. It was a sudden visit, but he graciously greeted Young-ho without a hint of reluctance. For Bergrim, Young-ho wasn't just his master, but his lifesaver. No, even more than that, Young-ho asked Bergrim while handing him the pieces of the crown. "Could you melt these and make something like a ring or bracelet?" Young-ho's eyes twinkled in anticipation. There was no way Bergrim could decline facing those eyes. Fortunately, he was good at making jewelry. Nodding his head in acceptance, Bergrim carefully reached out to take a look at the crown pieces. Young-ho quickly handed over the crown pieces to him. Bergrim tapped the crown pieces with his finger. It seemed as if he was listening to its sound, as at the same time he closed his eyes and began to feel them. Some of the great esteemed dwarves are said to be able to hear the sound of metal. Perhaps it's better to say that they can interact with the metal itself, is most likely trying to figure out the strength and ductility of the metal that makes up the crown pieces. Lucia explained to Young-ho. Young-ho was pleased with the fact that Bergrim was an esteemed dwarf and was delighted that he was working with a smile upon his face. After smiling at Young-ho, Bergrim took out a small blackboard and chalk that lay in the corner of the workshop. He asked Young-ho a question in poor demon language. "What should I make? Please choose the type and quantity." Young-ho looked around. Catalina's ears began to droop with embarrassment as she drew Young-ho's attention. After examining Catalina's ears, neck, and wrists, Young-ho soon made his decision. He thought of the rest of his spirits and then spoke to Bergrim. 2 rings, 1 for a man and 1 for a woman. 1 bracelet for a man and 1 anklet for a woman. And finally, a necklace. That one's for a man. If there's any metal left, just keep it. The rings were for Young-ho himself and Catalina, while the bracelet and anklet would belong to Eligor and Ophelia respectively. While, finally, the necklace was for Skull. Upon hearing Young-ho's order, Bergrim pondered for a moment and quickly wrote a new question on the board. "Is it for a wedding? A sign of solidarity?" Bergrim's gaze alternated between Young-ho and Catalina, causing Young-ho to quickly speak out. "No, nothing like that. There are just items to be given to some of the spirits. He'll wear one of the rings, while the rest will belong to Catalina, Eligor, Ophelia, and Skull respectively. You know who they are, right?" He almost emptied out all the air from his lungs. Young-ho didn't look back at Catalina. For some reason, after they had visited the auction house, he kept thinking about it. After looking around the room for a moment, he quietly spoke to Bergrim. "But it would be nice if you made them look pretty ill. Make a pair of rings and bracelets." Bergrim responded with a hearty grin, which Young-ho couldn't object to. "Thump thump, throb throb, throb flutter." Lucia spoke very quickly, and Young-ho found his face to cool off. He also asked Bergrim, while ignoring the fluttering noise from behind his back. "By the way, do you know anything about this metal? I've never seen this before." Its basic nature seems similar to silver. It was clear that Bergrim was an outstanding blacksmith, but he wasn't born in the demon world. He wasn't used to using the metals of the demon world. Young-ho asked another question. "If you're not going to use all of the crown, could you cut some off?" "Okay, I think around 3/4 will be enough." The crown wasn't that big in the first place, but it was far larger than a bracelet or ring. Bergrim broke one of the crown pieces in half again and handed it to Young-ho. "Okay, then please start work right away. I don't want to push you, but how long will it take? I'll finish them by tomorrow." Bergrim's answer was very refreshing. Young-ho patted him on the shoulder and took the piece of the crown. Young-ho then left the workshop alongside Catalina, who had now regained her calmness. "Let's go to the arena." Originally, he had planned to explore the stairs leading to the next underground floor, but he had changed his mind. For now, visiting the arena was more urgent. It was a metal that even Bergrim didn't recognize. Perhaps if it was Amon or Gusion, they might know. No, it was more likely that both of them would just know it as a metal that responded to the power of greed, and nothing else also. It was now time to challenge the arena again. Thanks to Agares' spirit, he had strengthened not only his mana, but his physical ability as well. Moreover, he also wanted to test out his newfound power. The mana of greed. Yong-ho hurried his steps. He headed to the arena. Yong-ho's arrival was the same as usual, as the man in the beast mask led the way. However, when he physically arrived at the arena, there was something different. Gusion. Although Yong-ho had only visited a few times before, Gusion had always been there early. He always stood with his back facing the entrance, as if he was pretending that he never waited. He only turned around after Yong-ho greeted him. This time, however, he was facing Yong-ho from the front. As soon as Yong-ho passed through the corridor, he seemed to know. Furthermore, it didn't end there. I have something to tell you. No, I have a favor to ask. Yong-ho squinted at the unexpected words. Catalina's eyes widened in surprise. Gusion scratched his cheek. It seemed that it was difficult for him to make a request. Talk to Kaiwan. That is my favor. Yong-ho's expression became even more subtle. Chapter 98. Door of Space 2. Gusion had asked for a favor. Furthermore, his request was for Yong-ho to have a conversation with Kaiwan. It was a suspicious question. Wasn't it Gusion who prevented him from having even a short conversation with Kaiwan in the first place? Facing Yong-ho's suspicious gaze, Gusion cleared his throat as if he was hiding something. Yong-ho continued to stare at him with his arms crossed. In the end, it was Gusion who spoke first. Time doesn't flow naturally here. It heard such from Amon. Time doesn't stop, but it doesn't flow normally, does it? For over 1,000 years, that was the secret why spirits in the arena were able to stay alive. It was no exaggeration to say that the arena was another world that existed within Mammon's dungeon. Gusion nodded. Yes. When you're here, you can't really feel the passage of time. 1 year is like a single minute, while 1 minute is like an entire year. I've spent at least 1,000 years here, but my senses don't remember the past years as 1,000 years. Sometimes it just feels like a year has passed, while other times it just feels like a few days. This space is such a place. Yong-ho was able to empathize to some extent. When he was in the arena, he couldn't really grasp the flow of time either. He had originally thought he had stayed for more than half a day during his last visit, but when he came out, it ended up being only 2 hours. But what connection was there between the nature of the arena and Kaiwan? Gusion pursed his lips. He then cut off his remaining hesitation and spoke. Kaiwan's spirit is on the verge of collapse. Gusion wasn't joking. His eyes were as serious as the time when he was telling the story of Mammon. I told you when you first came, didn't I? It has been decades since Kaiwan's disappearance. Yong-ho also remembered the time Kaiwan's pale face came to his mind. I don't know how time passes in this space, but we can't fool the absolute nature of time. No matter how we feel in this arena, time is still flowing. Gusion's voice sank heavily. It wasn't just the decades of Kaiwan. Gusion's voice contained 1,000 years following the death of Mammon. Kaiwan was in a poor condition from the beginning. She couldn't accept the reality that she had to stay in the arena. She had to leave so many things behind. The house of Mammon had only just begun to rise again. There were her faithful subordinates, and there was also her sickly younger brother waiting for her return. Kaiwan wasn't unique. The previous generations before Kaiwan had all eventually been defeated and locked up inside the arena. They too had to leave behind many things. But Yong-ho could understand Kaiwan's heart. He understood why she had such a strong obsession. The previous generations of owners were better off. The Mammon family was still alive and well developed, and they were proper successors. Unlike Kaiwan, Kaiwan would not have been devastated by her inability to leave the arena. It was clear that she was more concerned for her brother, who would not be able to make it without her, and who would remain alone within the house of Mammon. Kaiwan maintained herself through sheer belief. All she had left was her faith. Yong-ho understood. He remembered the questions she asked that day when he first met her. She spoke out unknowingly. Brother, will you come to the arena, even if it's just a descendant? Yong-ho closed his eyes. Gustion's voice went on. Visitors to the arena must be challenged at least once. But if you're with a companion, it doesn't matter which one of you accepts the challenge. Kaiwan pinned her hopes on that point. She said that there was a strong subordinate that could easily pass the first floor. What was his name? Endelion. It was a wish that could not be fulfilled. Ophelia's father, Endelion, was disappointed by Cayenne and left the Mammon family without him. Furthermore, Cayenne was unable to overcome the sudden attack of the crazy ants. The only passageway to the arena had been lost. That's how time passed, decades in absolute terms. But for Kaiwan, that time seemed like hundreds of years. Kaiwan, described in Cayenne's records, was a woman of steel. But the Kaiwan that Yong-ho encountered at the arena was like a piece of fractured glass ready to break. And then you appeared. Yong-ho opened his eyes. Guxian faced him. I had a hunch. You're not the one that Kaiwan wanted. There was even the possibility that you would provide the worst possible answer in Kaiwan's imagination. Is that why you interrupted? Guxian laughed bitterly. I am the manager of the arena. Kaiwan is a fighter of the arena and is among my favorites of Mammon's descendants. In the end, it was Guxian who was the righteous one at that time. Yong-ho sighed. He was as crude and clumsy as he had always been. Guxian continued. Kaiwan is no longer able to sustain herself just through belief, as she used to, all because you appeared with the truth. You know of what happened with Cayenne. Perhaps you might be able to bring him. Kaiwan's mind was sick, and finally, her limits had been reached. Yong-ho clenched his teeth. He now understood why Guxian had interfered. Was it reasonable to let Kaiwan know about her brother's death and the fall of the Mammon family? Guxian had judged that now the time had come. She had to face the truth, even if it were to break her. Yong-ho swallowed dry saliva. Catalina remained silent and even held her breath. Kaiwan's brother Cayenne died of illness. Yong-ho squeezed out his voice. He confided all he knew to Guxian, as if he was performing a rehearsal. It was a panorama of tragedy. Guxian lamented the fact that the former owner had committed suicide. That's the worst. Yong-ho thought so as well. Just imagining how Kaiwan would react to the news was horrible. But there's also a positive aspect, Guxian said. It wasn't something that he said casually. His voice was still subdued, but it was calm. Kaiwan's brother Cayenne became the owner of the Mammon family, married and even had children. He allowed the House of Mammon to continue on. It was an ordinary tale, but it was important that such mediocrity was achieved. Guxian laughed bitterly. He rubbed his lips a few times and then dropped his hands. Save Kaiwan. It's now time for her to get rid of her obsession. No answer was necessary. Guxian stepped back, and the man with the beast mask led Yong-ho again. Yong-ho ordered Catalina not to follow him. As Guxian has said, he couldn't really feel the flow of time. Just a few steps felt like an age. The man with the beast mask led Yong-ho to the arena's waiting room. In the waiting room, Kaiwan sat on a chair with a nervous expression on her face. Her eyes, visible between her gray hair, were filled with anxiety and fear rather than hope. Kaiwan looked up and saw Yong-ho. She opened her lips but couldn't speak. Her hunger for the truth was so great that it was difficult for her to squeeze out her voice. Yong-ho remembered the first time he saw Kaiwan. Some of her memories were left inside her mana. A small and shabby girl. A girl who cried and cried that she would never fall. Yong-ho swallowed his saliva once again. Without avoiding her gaze, he faced her from the front. He spoke in a surprisingly bold voice. Cayenne is dead. It happened a decade or so ago. There were no screams or howls. Yong-ho grabbed both of Kaiwan's shoulders. He told her a story that made her feel like she would be crushed into ashes. The word tired was insufficient to express how he felt. Guxian smiled at Yong-ho, who had now left the waiting room and returned to the arena. He patted Yong-ho's shoulder, as if pretending to be friendly. You've done enough. Now it's her problem. As the manager of the arena, I give you my utmost gratitude. Yong-ho recalled the Guxian he saw in Mammon's memory. This incident was proof that Guxian was a sincere person. After hearing the full story, Kaiwan fell asleep crying in Yong-ho's arms. What happened after she woke up was, as Guxian said, her own problem. Yong-ho sat down on the nearest chair. He then asked Guxian, who naturally sat down next to him. Didn't you say that conquering the arena would free the arena's spirits. I said that you could earn the spirits. Well, in the end, it's the same anyway. And no, that's enough. I'll keep that a secret. So, are you going to challenge the fourth floor now? Yong-ho laughed. Gusyeon hated that it made him somehow feel like a villain. Yong-ho shook his head a few times, pulled something out, and then spoke. Before that, there's something I would like to ask you. Aemon, the same goes for you. I want to know the identity of this metal. In Yong-ho's hand was a piece of the crown. Gusyeon saw it and smiled a little differently than before. Instead of taking the metal from Yong-ho's hand, he asked Yong-ho a question he didn't expect. Is that all of it? No, I've got my blacksmith making some jewelry to give to some of my spirits. He had originally intended to explain what the metal could do. Aemon was watching from the side, but not Gusyeon. However, Gusyeon's reaction made his thoughts disappear. You were right. He really is Mammon's true successor. Isn't that right, Aemon? As if to answer Gusyeon, the flames of a red lotus rose into the air. A soft voice accompanied the flames. Brigada God's metal. Fragments of the true king's flesh. It responds to the fragments of the soul. Instead of offering an explanation like Aemon, Gusyeon rolled up his sleeves. A black bracelet, hidden under his white suite, was revealed. Yong-ho wouldn't have known if he had seen it before, but now he knew. It was the same metal that made up the crown. It's something I received from Mammon. He was the first person in the demon world to discover its use in this way, just like you. All of us, except for Amon, he gave to the 12 spirits of Mammon, jewelry made out of Brigada. It was a voice full of sadness and deep longing. However, Yong-ho couldn't respond to Gusyeon. He wasn't surprised by the great tale of the true demon king, or the mysterious fragments of the flesh. When he heard Gusyeon's story, a question came to his mind. Gusyeon said that Mammon was the first one to use Brigada in this way. Did that mean that kings before Mammon's era failed to recognize the true nature of Brigada? Or was Brigada only discovered during Mammon's time? Perhaps it was neither. Yong-ho came up with one possibility: the 12 spirits of Mammon. Even after Mammon's death, they were subjugated to the maze of greed. Gusyeon knew what Yong-ho was thinking. Once again, he burst out laughing. He gave Yong-ho a good answer. Yes, the 12 spirits of Mammon. We are the first true dungeon spirits of the demon world. The current system of dungeon spirits is nothing more than an imitation of the original created by Mammon. The flames of the red lotus rose up. Ammon's voice echoed in Yong-ho's mind. My young master, I can now draw out the power of greed. For generations, the kings who ruled this world were those who possessed the power of sin. And now it's time to learn why. Light shone from the Brigada in Yong-ho's palm. The green flames of greed arose through the guidance of Amon and Gusyeon. The true power of the 7 deadly sins revealed itself. Visit and read more novel to help us update chapter quickly. Thank you so much. Chapter 99. Door of Space 3. I feel sorry for the owner of the 4th floor. Gusyeon laughed and crossed his legs. Catalina sat next to him, in the special reserved seat, instead of Amon. Unlike Gusyeon, who was full of contentment and composure, Catalina looked at the arena with a nervous expression. On each side of the wide circular arena stood each of the participants. Standing on the left was the Crimson Ogre, Victor, the 4th floor master, and on the right was Yong-ho, the owner of the House of Mammon. Crimson Ogres were the elites of the Ogre race, similar to the Hobgoblins of the Goblins race and the War Orcs of the Orc race. Not only were Crimson Ogres much larger than the typical ogre, they were also red all over, similar to the Red Demon race. The red light emanating from both of the Crimson Ogre's eyes looked terrifying. Furthermore, Victor wasn't simply an ordinary Crimson Ogre. He was a powerful force compared to ordinary Crimson Ogres, one of which had threatened the House of Mammon on the day that Yong-ho had ascended to the throne. However, Yong-ho wasn't afraid of Victor. It was thanks to his experience against previous powerful enemies, but it was more due to his concern with what Aemon was currently saying to him in his mind. Brigada is a fragment of the true Demon King's flesh. Because of this, it responds to the 7 deadly sins, which are fragments of the soul of the true Demon King. Both fragments mutually resonate with one another. Horses, but my young master, stay focused. Brigada is like a lantern that guides one's way through the darkness, and even you, who is still inexperienced, will be able to unleash the power of greed with Brigadier's help. Yong-ho didn't know what the true Demon King was. It was also the first time he had ever heard of the terms fragments of flesh or the fragments of the soul. But he somehow naturally understood. A light arose from the piece of crown grasped in his left hand. The aura of greed burned not only on the surface of his body, but it also penetrated deep inside him. It became one with the flow of his mana. The power of greed was extremely rough. It was difficult for them to combine naturally, but they had definitely become one. The flesh desired the soul, and the soul desired the flesh. The current intensity was not a rejection. Rather, it was evidence of the strong synergy taking place between them. Focus and yearn for it. The 7 deadly sins came from the soul of the true Demon King. Therefore, each sin has a different nature. With the mu of Ixbacade, the root of greed is hunger, desire, covetousness. Liberate the power of greed. Young-ho drew in his breath. He strongly held Aemon up in front of him. He connected to his desires, just as Amon had requested him. He thought of each of his desires one by one. The flames of greed burned even brighter. The things he wanted to do, the things he wanted to enjoy. He was true to himself. He yearned with purity. Greed was not dependent on the nature of the desire. Rather, it was the strength of the desire. The more powerful greed became, and the more powerful he became. The Crimson Ogre's eyes shook as he gazed at Yong-ho. The aura emanating from Yong-ho was unusual. Victor's reasoning was shouting to him that he had to rush Yong-ho right away, but his instincts refused. It wasn't just the mere flames that bothered him. In Victor's eyes, the flames instead looked like a living creature. The flames seemed to create a figure of a terrifying being. Victor's breath became rough. Yong-ho's breath, on the other hand, became increasingly calm. The flames still seemed to be wild and out of control, but in reality they weren't. They were under Yong-ho's control. A little more. Desire, a little more. Yearn for it, my young master. Master of greed, Amon loudly exclaimed. Yong-ho desired, he desired to win. He desired to defeat the floor master of the 4th floor, to gain Mammon's mana, and to take the artifacts from Gusion. He also wanted to see Kaiwan again. He wanted to save Kaiwan and make Gusion his loyal subordinate. It was exhilarating to imagine Gusion calling him master, and Yong-ho stepped forward. He hit the ground and raced towards the Crimson Ogre. He was as straight and fast as a loose arrow. All the flames from Yong-ho's body concentrated together and were then channeled into Amon. Victor reacted. He suppressed his instincts to flee by letting out a roar. And with that roar, he charged towards Yong-ho. Catalina tightly clutched her hands together. Gusion rose from his seat with a fierce smile upon his face. Dodging was the right thing to do. The answer was for Yong-ho to use his quick agility to dodge Victor's attack and then counterattack his side. That's what Catalina wished for. However, Gusion didn't think so, and neither did Yong-ho. Victor's roar filled the arena. He swung his huge iron club with all his might, causing it to resemble a thunderbolt. However, Yong-ho did not avoid the thunderbolt-like club. He firmly stood face to face with his opponent. He thrusted Aemon towards Victor. He liberated the power of greed. The unleashed power was overwhelming. The great torrent of power was like a tyrant destroying everything in its path. Victor's iron club couldn't reach Yong-ho. It was deflected at a similar thunderbolt-like speed, a powerful mass of power that could no longer be said to resemble a simple flame, smashed into Victor. The power was so overwhelming that only the expression swallowed was appropriate to describe its impact. Victor's upper body was completely annihilated by the flames, and yet the unrelenting momentum of the flames did not slow down. Instead, they began to burn the surrounding atmosphere and then collide with the invisible wall that surrounded the arena. The impact of the enormous force shook the entire arena. Catalina gazed at Yong-ho with rapt attention. The arena's spirits in the audience were rendered speechless. Among them, those who were past masters of the House of Mammon understood instinctively. That was greed. That was the power of the 7 deadly sins. In terms of absolute power, Yong-ho still wasn't powerful enough to reach them, but yet he still unnerved them. Their intrinsic quality of power was different. As the saying goes, they were in different worlds. Gusyon smiled brightly. He unknowingly whispered Mammon's name into the air. Victor was sure to have seen it. The face of greed. The appearance of the true king from the fragment of the king's soul. There was no reason to wait for Victor's resurrection. Gusyon was completely convinced. He now looked at Yong-ho, young master, with friendly eyes. Yong-ho exhaled and stretched out his stance. He didn't think of correcting his posture. There seemed to be an indescribable sense of power within him that dominated his whole body. This was greed. This was the power of the 7 deadly sins. But that wasn't all. It was only just the beginning. He had only experienced the tip of the iceberg. Great job, my young master. True, I believed that you could do it, Ayman softly spoke. But, with a hint of laughter mixed within, it was the first time that Yong-ho had ever heard Ayman laugh. However, my young master, your desires are mostly related to women. And so was the last desire that you thought of right at the end. Twict. I understand that the young master is currently in his prime, but you've not even experienced a woman yet. How come? Yong-ho's whole body suddenly froze in quite a different sense than ever before. His sense of accomplishment, which had been seething throughout his body, suddenly died. For some reason, a strong silence hovered around Yong-ho. A small amount of cold sweat seemed to drip from his forehead. After a while, Armin spoke again. I'll keep it a secret from Gusyon. Should he be thankful or asked to be left alone? Fortunately, Armin was caring, unlike Gusyon. Armin transformed from his lance form back into a bracelet. In addition, Armin's presence, which he had initially felt beside him, now felt distant. Master. Master. Catalina's bright voice could now be heard, as the invisible barrier surrounding the arena had now disappeared. As expected, her ears and tail were flapping while she waved towards him. Her cheeks seemed to be burning with excitement. When Yong-ho remembered the last desire he had during the battle against Victor, he quickly turned around after waving his hand a little. As he turned away from Gusion's gaze, he reached out towards Mammon's mana emanating from Victor's body. He absorbed Mammon's mana. Visit and read more novel to help us update chapter quickly. Thank you so much. Chapter 100. Door of Space 4. His current mana was enough to defeat the floor of the 4th floor with a single strike. Moreover, he had still to test the full capabilities of his physical body, which had been reborn after defeating Agarez. However, instead of challenging the 5th floor, Yong-ho chose to go back for now. The ostensible justification was that he believed it would better to fight the master of the 5th floor after receiving the Brigada jewelry from Bergram, whereas the actual, real reason behind his decision was that he might desire to commit suicide if he had to unleash the power of his desires again. But he'll still have to take care of it. He picked a box of light with the power of greed and received a good-looking pair of manacles in the air. They looked like an item for a bare-handed fighter. He'll give these to Eligor. Eligor now possessed strong mana, and recently he had been honing the southern martial art, taught by Ophelia, which was a bare-handed art, so the manacles were perfect for him. Are you already leaving? Why? Don't you want to try the 5th floor? It was the voice of Gusyon, who seemed a little sad. But he couldn't change Yong-ho's mind. No, that's it for today. I'll come back tomorrow with the Brigada jewelry. Please take care of Kaiwan, don't worry, I'll watch over her. The price of her facing the truth won't be small, but I'm sure she'll overcome it. It wasn't just a pretense that Gusyon cared about Kaiwan. Yong-ho sincerely hoped that Kaiwan would overcome her troubles. I'll see you tomorrow then. Yes, I look forward to it, young master. Yong-ho, who was about to turn around after saying farewell, suddenly stopped in his tracks. He asked back unknowingly, what farewell? No, not that. Yong-ho pressed him for an answer, but Gusyon just ignored him. Catalina, who was standing behind him, gave a small smile. In the end, rather than pressing for an answer, Yong-ho just lightly chuckled. Instead of asking more questions, he turned around. Unlike the first time, Gusyon now felt quite pleased. I'll keep going. For the day when hell be able to conquer the arena, Yong-ho stepped forward. The man in the beast mask silently appeared and led Yong-ho and Catalina out of the arena. The next morning, Yong-ho overslept. Fatigue, which had come in exchange for the liberation of greed, was accompanied by an inexplicable dream. Master, are you all right? So sometimes you need to forget about everything and take some well-earned rest. How about taking the day off for today? At Lucius' worried tone, Young-ho breathed out a sigh of relief. Although Lucia was connected to his mind, she was fortunately unable to see his peculiar dream. No, it's okay. I've already had quite a good rest. I've got a lot of work to get done today. As he replied to Lucia, Young-ho clenched his fist. The combination of his natural manner and the power of greed was still very weak. I've only just opened the door, instinctively he understood. And he also seemed to understand what Aemon meant when he had earlier spoken of the 7 deadly sins. Only those who possess the power of the 7 deadly sins can reign as kings. Only they can rule the world. At the moment, the Crimson Ogre, Victor, was overwhelmed by the power of greed. Young-ho too was overcome by such power. It was because he had just taken a small glance at the huge iceberg hidden beneath the surface of the water. Mammon, the king of greed. The fact that Young-ho himself was the successor of such a great figure had just struck a new chord within him. It had already been a rather long time since he had inherited the House of Mammon, but it was the first time that he had ever felt so strongly about the significance of his existence. Young-ho stood up. After stretching, he washed his face with the water left in his room. He began the day. After spending the morning eating and carrying out some personal training, Young-ho took Catalina, Eligor, and Skull to visit Bulgrim's workshop. Bulgrim, who seemed to be much more tired than usual, welcomed Young-ho. The dark circles under his eyes seemed to have formed during the night. They've been well made. His complexion looked bad, but he still smiled proudly. Bulgrim quickly put away the chalkboard that he was using to communicate with, placed the newly made jewelry onto a tray, and then handed them to Young-ho. One of the pieces must have just been finished, as Bulgrim had just removed it from the workbench. Wow, Young-ho was amazed. Every single piece of jewelry was beautiful. The rings, with small embedded green emeralds, looked like a pear. Since the crown was originally gold, the rings too were gold, with a bit of embellishment regarding the embedded jewel, causing them to look elegant and classy. The bracelet and anklet were also a pair. If the rings pursued a clean, elegant style, then the bracelet and anklet looked more stylish. They were covered with scales reminiscent of a dragon. The necklace, however, was completely made out of brigada. It was also adorned with a dragon's head that looked as if it was about to breathe fire. You've done an amazing job. Your work is really admirable. You felt like you should give him a prize for his hard work. Of course, for Bulgrim, the best prize would be for Young-ho to invoke his evolutionary power. However, to do so, Bulgrim still needed to fill his evolution rate. Young-ho quickly invoked the power of evolution to examine Bulgrim's evolutionary potential. Although it wasn't really a prize, Young-ho gave Bulgrim a promise for his next evolution. Next time, I'll strengthen your mana. It's a promise. Just his word was enough. Bulgrim knew that Young-ho was a man of his word. Young-ho immediately began the distribution of the jewelry. He handed Skull the necklace and gave Eligor the bracelet. Young-ho placed one of the rings onto his right hand. Now, other than for Ophelia, there was only one left to give. Thump, 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 flutter, flutter. Lucia imitated Catalina's heart. Ignoring Lucia's antics, Young-ho took a deep breath. He smiled awkwardly and then spoke to Catalina. "Give me your hand." Catalina bit her lower lip. Young-ho carefully reached out and placed the ring on Catalina's long, slender finger. Thump, 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 thump. Lucia continued to make noise to increase the awkwardness of the situation. Catalina's flapping ears and tail expressed her fervent joy. After giving her the ring, Young-ho quickly turned around and let out a series of coughs while scratching his face. Come to think of it, it was the first time he had ever given a woman a gift. Yesterday, I gave you a rough explanation of the nature of brigada, didn't I? So, from now on, it'll be able to empower you, so please accept the power. Young-ho quickly spoke, and then aroused the power of greed light, suddenly emanated from the jewelry worn by Catalina, Eligor, and Skull. Wow. Unlike Catalina, who quickly combined the power of greed with her own mana, since she had already experienced it before, Eligor and Skull struggled while making a series of strange sounds. Skull, however, soon regained his composure and managed to gain control of his mana. albeit with difficulty. However, Eligor did not. He continued to sweat profusely and struggled to control his mana. He still has a long way to go. Yesterday, Catalina had successfully controlled her mana when Yong-ho first experimented with the Brigada, despite having to wield a much larger amount of mana compared to today. But that was inevitable. Unlike Eligor and Skull, Catalina had experienced the pressure of the dungeon market's auction house. Moreover, her talent for mana was even better than Ophelius. Eligor, don't be too upset. Once Ophelia arrives shortly, it'll provide you with special training. Although Yong-ho tried to cheer him up, Eligor still seemed to be rather dejected. Yong-ho smiled and gathered up the power of greed. After saying farewell to Bergrim, he led his spirits out of the workshop, and as if she was waiting for that precise moment, Lucia suddenly spoke. Master, I've recently received a report from the dungeon meerkats. They've spotted Ophelia in the distance. It seems that she shall be arriving at the dungeon in about 10 minutes. Her arrival is about an hour earlier than scheduled, but I don't think it's because of anything important going on. Perfect. He would be able to give her the anklet and then ask her to train with Eligor. He could then focus on the arena for the rest of the afternoon. Master Ophelia is here. Shall we all go out and meet her? At Yong-ho's words, Eligor made a somewhat complicated expression. His face displayed a mixture of both joy and suffering. Yong-ho led the spirits to the entrance room of the dungeon, and Ophelia, as always, provided Yong-ho with the recent news. We're going to need a new dungeon.